We talked on a couple of days last week about front pageophobia, about the fact that Starmer, as is probably best evinced at the moment with the winter fuel payment policy, is not going to govern by front page. He certainly is not frightened of the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail in many ways are sort of abnegating their role as a critic of government because they've got Boris Johnson on the payroll. I don't know if you remember the stories of Boris Johnson's wallpaper, the 7,000 pounds that had to be paid even just to cover it up. I don't know if you even knew that story. While he was Prime Minister, another £7,000 worth of taxpayers' cash was spent on painting over the infamous gold wallpaper that he got into trouble for buying in the first place. But he also saw the resignation of his own ethics advisors over his attempts to cover up and claim that he'd forgotten who paid for the debt. So, the scandal, on a scale of 1 to 10, the scandal of Boris Johnson's home decor would be an 8, and the scandal of Keir Starmer's wife's wardrobe would be a 1 or a 2. But it's still on the scale. And absolutely essential that nobody pretends otherwise. It's still on the scale. The Daily Mail, with which I have a peculiar obsession because of the damage done to our country by its editor-in-chief Paul Dacre and his attacks upon everything from the independence of our judiciary to academic freedom to parliamentary democracy, all of the great British values of our time under repeated and sustained attack from the man that used to edit that newspaper. That's where my peculiar obsession comes from. They have him on the payroll. They have Johnson on the payroll, the man who rode roughshod over every constitutional norm in this country, tried to rewrite the rules of parliamentary ethics after one of his allies, Owen Paterson, was found to have smashed them to smithereens in pursuit of personal profit, and who, of course, ran away from Parliament rather than actually be held accountable for his own actions in lying repeatedly to them, denied his constituents in Uxbridge the right of demanding a recall. He legged it, he hid, he dug a big hole and buried himself in it before any of those democratic norms could be enacted, and Paul Dacre responded by rewarding him with an enormous column in the Daily Mail. A case of quid pro quo, if you like, because, of course, Boris Johnson was keen to install Paul Dacre as, I kid you not, the chair of Ofcom, the organisation that has oversight of all broadcasters in the country, up to and including me. So that was what Boris Johnson thought the media should look like, and what Paul Dacre thought the government should look like involved a man who lied as if it was going out of fashion, who filled his pockets, or at least his home, with gifts from all manner of tycoons, tried to keep it secret, and then claimed that he'd forgotten where all the money came from every time he walked into the flat where the fruits of his donors' largesse were literally painted all over the walls, plastered all over the walls. So that would be an 8. But it doesn't stop, and this is the point, it doesn't stop the Daily Mail pretending that Keir Starmer is the new John Profumo. It doesn't stop them pretending that he has engaged in behaviour at least as scandalous as I've already said John Profumo. What else is up there with enormously scandalous political behaviour? And there it is. Why can't millionaire Starmers buy their own clothes? Front of the Times, a lot more sober. Starmer's wife had £5,000 worth of clothes paid for by donor. And that's just true. That is the facts. The rules, as they stand, are to do with conflict of interest. So they didn't believe... Let's get the facts out there first before we have a look at what's going on in Idiot's Corner. The facts of the matter are that this has only come to the attention of the authorities because the Starmers thought they didn't have to declare it, and then they were given advice that they did, at which point they came forward. That, to me, is the first mistake. I think because of the environment in which they find themselves, and it's not front pageophobia, this. It's not front pageophobia. This is the importance of putting clear blue water between themselves and the corruption that has gone before. The corruption particularly typified by Boris Johnson. I could stay on air until long after Sheila's show has finished and not even come close to fully chronicling all of the corruptions, the mendacities and the disgraces of Boris Johnson's regime. But that doesn't matter. Neither does it matter that the Daily Mail puts Boris Johnson back in a position of prominence, literally rewards him for being the biggest liar in the history of our Prime Minister's office. That none of that matters. Starmer has to be judged according to Starmer. It would be whataboutery to keep drawing the comparison. It's important to get it out there early, just to highlight the hypocrisy of people claiming that this is a particularly pungent scandal. But it is a big, for me at least, and we'll open up the phone line shortly, and you will be able to tell me why it isn't. This opens the door to a perception that they're all as bad as each other. And it's not a perception that is entirely unfair. So the footballification element of this conversation is pretty clear. Oh, do we know who paid for Johnson's holiday on that fancy desert island? Do we know? Did we ever find out who actually paid for that? You see what you see what I mean? No attempt to lie, but there was a failure to over-disclose, I would call it. And that opens the door to a perception among normal people like you and me, well, you at least, I don't know how normal I am, to think that they're all as bad as each other. Why would you do this? These are all questions that we're going to ask in a minute. 0345 606 0973 will be the number that you need. So I think this is a bigger mistake than some of Keir Starmer's allies would allow. I don't think it is a behavioural error or an ethical error. It's not a question of standards, it's a question of judgment. So here's what I would have done. I'd have over-declared. I would have told the authorities that my wife was in receipt of largesse from a party donor, even if I wasn't required to. To be honest with you, and I haven't consulted Mrs. O'Brien over this, and it's highly unlikely that I end up in politics, but I'm not sure I would have taken it in the first place. I mean, I am, sadly, at this stage in my life, almost preternaturally scruffy. I don't know why. So I walk past mirrors sometimes and I think, who the hell dressed him? And then I remember it was me. I didn't used to be like this. And I think, as I enter the midpoint of my 6th decade, I might start trying to pull my socks up, both metaphorically and literally. But I didn't used to be very scruffy. And there is a relationship between how good you look and money. When I interviewed Tony Blair the other week, I could tell you that his suit would be well into 4 figures. I can spot that from a mile off as a consequence of my days in menswear. And actually, the odder your shape, the odder your body shape, the more wise it is to spend as much money as you can possibly afford on good tailoring, if that's how you want to look. So I can talk the talk, I just struggle to walk the walk. I'm not an expert on women's clothes, but I assume some of these things hold equally true, particularly on alterations tailors, actually. I think that's an expense that if you are going to be judged by your appearance pretty heavily, and we know that partners of politicians, for good or for ill, female partners of male politicians are scrutinised extraordinarily, then a good alterations tailor will be worth their weight in metaphorical gold. But you have to tell people if you take something from anyone. I just don't understand how they've made this mistake. Even the defence of saying we didn't think we had to creates the possibility of it coming out later. I think, and I never know exactly what the angle I'm going to take on a program is until I start talking to you. I can think about something all weekend, but until I actually open my gob, I don't actually know exactly where my needle is going to end up pointing on the sort of Richter scale of concern or anger or upset or hilarity, depending on what the story is that we're discussing. And so quite often, the more I talk about something, as I try and explain the twists and turns of it to you, the more my own opinion crystallizes. And although we're not going to join in any of the ludicrous attempts to pretend that this is even on the same planet as the scandals which Boris Johnson was busted for, I think this is a bigger misstep than people like David Lammy have acknowledged over the course of the weekend while being interviewed. I think Yvette Cooper was doing the rounds this morning. I presume she was asked about it, but I didn't hear what she had to say. Female colleague said to me this morning, you don't know what it's like to be a woman, which I think we can all agree is true. I have no idea what it's like to be a woman. And the scrutiny to which you are exposed, the way in which Cherie Blair, for example, was written about and talked about was hideous at times. I think one Daily Mail columnist called her the Wicked Witch, which you have to presume was an allusion, at least in part, to what he considered her physical appearance to represent. I don't see it myself, but you know that these things are normal, and therefore the idea that Mrs. Starmer very suddenly has to cut a swathe, has to cut a look far superior or far more likely to be scrutinised than anything she's had to do before. And the key area here would be repetition. So you've got, what, 4 frocks? 4 go-to frocks, maybe 1 or 2 go-to frocks that you know you look the business in. And if you've got to go somewhere where you need to look the business, you'll wear that frock, or you'll wear one of 3 or 4 if you're lucky. And of course, for everybody else, that's normal. But for somebody like that, you wear the same dress twice, it's actually a news story. So these aren't excuses. These are explanations of why perhaps they needed more clothes, more high-end clothes, than they would ordinarily have been able to buy for themselves in the very short-term window available. But I'm not buying that either. I just think that if you are Keir Starmer, then your priorities outside of the political sphere, your PR priorities, are to persuade the British public that you are nothing like what has gone before. And this, I'm afraid, is a bar knocked off the hurdle. If this was a dressage competition, that's 4 faults. He's knocked that one down. He didn't have to do it, but he has. So I don't do phone-ins really about how big a deal you think a story is, but I do flirt with the question occasionally and giving you the scale of this being a 1 to a 2. Here is something that shouldn't have happened but did, and we brought it to the attention of the authorities. It's not anywhere near. Here is something that we desperately tried to hide from the authorities. We tried to cover up, and we lied about until we were blown sky high by our own ethics advisor, resigning in protest at our inability to tell the truth. So you know and I know that that's chalk and cheese. But I still think this is a problem. I still think this is the problem. So David Lammy said yesterday, the truth is that successive prime ministers, unless you're a billionaire like the last one, do rely on political donations so they can look their best, both in the hope of representing the country, if you're in the opposition, or indeed as prime minister. So I am going to ask whether you care. What? No, I'm not. Well, yes, I am. I have now. 0345 6060973. But what do you... How big a misstep is this? How let down do you feel by Keir Starmer on the question of putting clear blue water between himself and the obvious corruption that went before? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And if you know more about clothes than I do, which again is highly likely, if you know more about clothes than I do, how do we actually feel about the idea that our Prime Minister doesn't earn enough? Do you know how I got into... Good Lord, I completely missed the biggest opportunity ever for one of my most hackneyed and overused anecdotes. My entire journalistic career hinges upon a Prime Minister buying a suit. Did you know that? I would not be here today were it not for a Prime Minister buying a suit in the early 1990s, mid-1990s. That's absolutely extraordinary. And I'm 99% certain he paid for it himself. So... what do we think about the broader question of donors buying clothes, glasses, outfits for prime ministers? I'm pretty confident it's a no-no. And I don't quite understand why Keir Starmer's done it. So that can be a question as well. I can't get excited about it, says Brian. I don't need you to get excited, Brian. I need you to get engaged. Should they be taking money? Ever? Or clothes, rather, from anybody else, from donors? And why do you think they've done this? 0345 6060973. Knowing what we know about Keir Starmer, don't know much about his wife. Why have they done something that leaves them so obviously open to criticism?